As far back as 2,500 years ago, people have been adulterating the food we eat: wine, bread, coffee, tea, spices, and more. Adulteration means to render something poorer in quality by adding another substance, typically an inferior one. We're talking about culinary poisons like lead, copper, mercury, things that seriously affect public health. And ancient Greeks and Romans spoke out on this issue, and were among the first to promote the idea that what we eat affects our health. Around the turn of the 19th century, though, something changed. Food adulteration exploded in use, and it would take a brand new type of scientist, the chemist, to take up the issue: Friedrich Accum. This is his story.
So Friedrich Accum was Friedrich. His original name in the German form was Friedrich. Later on, it changed to Friedrich. Accum was born in Germany from a little town nearby Hanover. His father was a soap maker. So it might have been with this father that he learned the first rudiments of chemistry.
Accum then honed his skills as an apprentice in a pharmacy with the Brand family, apothecaries to King George III, whereupon he moved to England in 1793.
At the time, chemistry and pharmacy were very much linked. So all his background in chemistry, he got it through pharmacy. And pharmacy is an area to be applied, to be used, it's to make good for people. So I think this always has been in the mind of Accum. Chemistry to be used by people, to make people's lives better.
The Industrial Revolution of the late 1700s and early 1800s fundamentally changed the world.
The development of chemistry at the beginning of the 1800s was so big. Chemistry was a new science.
Population growth and standards of living rose simultaneously for millions. People began living in closer proximity to one another in expanding cities. And all this mass manufacturing, energy production, and capitalist consumption also extended to food manufacturing, as people now found themselves far removed from the primary sources of food on the farm.
At the same time that chemistry was developed enough, this development of chemistry also contributed for more fraud in food. The more it was developed for analysis to detect the adulteration, the contamination, at the same time this also allowed to find more contaminants and more fraudulent agents.
After Accum moved to England, he connected with some other well-known scientists, where his later work in food adulteration would form its foundations.
Very important people in the world of science: William Nicholson and Anthony Carlyle. And one of them, Nicholson, was to found the Journal of Natural Philosophy, Chemistry and the Arts. Accum published there in 1798 his first paper.
In addition to publishing, Accum was also an early pioneer of gas lighting in London, and an accomplished lecturer. Well-known American scientists came to study with Accum in his lab in England. But despite how well-respected Accum was to the public, there was one extremely famous scientist who very much didn't like him.
Humphrey Davy, who hated actually Friedrich Accum. Humphrey Davy was the chemist. In the official history of chemistry, Davy discovered himself most of the metals from the first and second group of periodic table. So it was more a work on pure chemistry. Accum, as I said, was more this applied chemistry, which was actually very much criticized by people like Humphrey Davy. It was a completely different idea of chemistry.
After a brief stint as lab assistant to Humphrey Davy at the Royal Institution, Accum went on to lecture with the newly formed Surrey Institution.
So his lectures at the Surrey Institution became very popular. Men, women, all ages. There is this very famous cartoon depicting one of his sessions, and it's packed with people.
Unlike with Humphrey Davy, there are only a few depictions of Accum. This engraving by Thomas Rowlandson shows Accum at the height of his popularity around 1809. He can be seen giving a chemical demonstration at the Surrey Institution before a packed house.
The man who robs a fellow subject of a few shillings on the highway is sentenced to death. while he who distributes a slow poison to a whole community escapes punishment.
It's a period where people were eating lots of trash. Food adulteration was a serious problem. It was very common to use by food producers, by grocers, heavy metal salts, for instance, copper salts. Usually copper salts are green. So if you have some pickles or so that are already a little old, adding a little bit of these green salts, despite being a very toxic metal, this was done at the time. Vinegar, it was also common to be fortified with sulfuric acid. Cream could be thickened with starch, mercury, very extremely toxic. Red salts of mercury were being used as food coloring agents. Even spices, often, according to Accum, had sweeping dust. Bread had other white powders besides flour. This was common to find aluminum in bread. Another thing was to use lead sugar. It's sweet and very poisoning.
Indeed, it would be difficult to mention a single article of food which is not to be met with in an adulterated state. And there are some substances which are scarcely ever to be procured genuine.
But food additives aren't all bad. They have legitimate use to this day, including to maintain or improve safety and freshness, to improve or maintain nutritional value, and to improve taste, texture, and appearance. But in the early 1800s, the primary reason to add something to food was simply to make more money, regardless of the cost to public health.
It was just easy money, which is unfortunately not a problem only of that time. I think it's a problem of mankind of all the ages.
And this brings us to the issue that Accum is most famous for, his book, A Treatise on the Adulterations of Food and Culinary Poisons.
His book on this subject was the very first book that appeared. And he went very far, because in his book on food adulteration, he denounces some food producers giving their names. Of course, he created many enemies.
The cover of the book contains this quote, "There is death in the pot," which makes reference to a Bible verse in which prophets cook a stew with a poisonous ingredient. Accum meticulously analyzed various food products, utilizing his years of experience in applied chemistry to determine exactly what constituent ingredients each product contained. Some of the ingredients he found were admittedly not that harmful, but others were absolutely deadly. Here's a list of ingredients Accum discovered hiding in everyday products such as wine, bread, beer, tea, coffee, cream, mustard, ketchup, mushrooms, soda water, confectionery, custard, pickles, olive oil, pepper, cheese, and vinegar. What made this book so groundbreaking were Accum's detailed explanations of the scientific method. He not only published what he found, he also published how he conducted his experiments so the reader could replicate and confirm his results.
The design of the treatise will be fully answered if it should tend to impress on the mind of the public the magnitude of an evil which, in many cases, prevails to an extent so alarming that we may exclaim with the sons of the prophet, "There is death in the pot." For the abolition of such nefarious practices, it is the interest of all classes of the community to cooperate.
And Accum took his advocacy for public health so far that he published the names of individual people involved in trafficking adulterated food.
He gave names of companies, firms, food producers. Of course, many people felt attacked. And having enemies, observing the patterns of a person, one always can find something that you can accuse the person at the end.
There are conflicting accounts on what exactly happened, but shortly after his book on food adulteration was published, Accum was accused of theft and mutilation of books.
So he ripped off some pages of some books at the library of the Royal Institution.
At the time, before photocopies, ripping pages out of books was not that unusual.
It was quite common. Someone observed, it seems, through the hole. There was this cabinet next to the library, and the assistant librarian somehow watched him through that hole. Maybe there were already suspicions. Maybe it was not the first time that he did that. All his enemies, they made a big propaganda of this. Accum did not show up in the court. So by then, probably he was already in Germany.
Accum would spend the rest of his life teaching in Germany, having been run out of England for his work combating food adulteration. And sadly, he did not live to see any laws put in place to regulate food additives, despite his efforts. It would be 22 years after his death, in 1860, that the first food adulteration law came into being, and another 15 years before these laws had any real enforcement or effect.
One has to see that the book of Accum was on the origin of the first laws of Great Britain for public health. The world of Accum is very different from ours, but there are many essential problems and trends and habits and traditions also that they remain.